Welcome so much, everyone who's here. I'm RL, and I'm going to be moderating the next hour and a half or so of the Soil Science Conference. I'm an artist, a writer, a ceramicist. I dramatize social entanglements between the social and material worlds. I'm really interested in soil and soil as an archive. I'm a founding member of the Urban Soils Institute's Art Extension Service, and I'm based in Baltimore, Maryland on Piscataway land. So I'm really interested in soil and memory. And using the medium of the ground to think about the endurance of plantation slavery, indigenous dispossession of land, industrial capitalism, and the way they have marked the land and shaped the ground beneath us. So this panel is called Perfect Knowledge of the Ground, and Perfect Knowledge of the Ground is an ongoing project of mine that started this spring at the Washington Project for the Arts. And I call it a knowledge propagation project that's organized to reframe the roots of the current ecological crisis and to share Black and Indigenous alternatives to the capitalist and colonialist episteme. And I call it a knowledge propagation project because the original project was a sort of virtual bookshelf with selections of readings and a printed reader that had selections from the virtual bookshelf compiled and printed. So this project is in the model of, I guess, seed saving. It's my attempt to propagate seeds of some thinkers and thoughts that have been critical to my understanding of the social dynamics of human relationship to soil. So the original project at the Washington Project for the Arts, because of COVID, became a care package that was sent out to free participants that included a printed reader and selections of seeds that people planted and then shared the growing process with a wider audience through pictures. So this is the reader that was printed. It's about 140 pages long, and here are some seeds. And in this second iteration of the project, Red Dirt and Margaret Boozer have helped to reprint the reader, and the reader is being sold online. Let's see. The reader is being sold online. And let's see. I'm going to put the link to the reader in the chat. But the sale of the reader is going to support the panelists today, and then also a sliding scale for BIPOC people. So information about this project and a way to get your own care package of the reader is in the chat. So just a little overview of how this is going to go. We have Three folks joining us for the panel, Dr. Suzanne Pierre, Kunal Palawat, and Makalé Cullen, and they're all going to just talk a little bit about their own work, and then I have some questions that I have been really excited to talk with them about. If you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat. We will kind of talk amongst the panelists and then open it up for questions from the audience. And Blaine Snipstall was going to join us today, but he had a last minute family thing that he had to be at, so he couldn't join us. But I'm going to play a little snippet of an interview with him that will hopefully add his perspective to the conversation. So let's see, let me stop sharing my screen. First, Sue Pierre is going to talk, and Sue is the director of the Critical Ecology Lab, which is a nonprofit research lab uncovering the social underpinnings of global ecological change. Suzanne is a terrestrial biogeochemist and forest ecologist, a queer woman of color, first-generation American, and proud New Jersey local. She's currently based in Oakland, California, Ramaytush Ohlone territory.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Raina. Should I just get started? Okay. Thank you. Yes, good morning or good afternoon or good evening, depending on your time zone. My name is Suzanne. I am, as Arl introduced me, I'm the director of the Critical Ecology Lab. And along with, I'm joined with my collaborator, Kunal Palawat today. And the Critical Ecology Lab is a nonprofit research organization that grew out of essentially a restlessness and a question about how we study ecosystems and the lenses that we apply to kind of formal Western scientific investigations of both ecosystems ecology as well as the cycling of elements around the world. And really those questions came from my dissatisfaction with the types of hypotheses and framings that I learned about in graduate school several years ago now, and the ways that those questions, particularly around what scientists describe as global change, which encompasses climate change, but goes beyond climate change as well, and the way that global change in particular was framed as a really nebulous and difficult to pinpoint type of propagating problem. And my lens as a woman of color and an immigrant and someone who did not get trained in science or brought up in science, Western science, in the way that I think a lot of folks who are kind of naturalized into Western science can feel and experience that process. Those personal backgrounds allowed me to kind of notice that the ways that global change is being addressed really kind of erases or obfuscates the specific population responsibilities and the intergenerational responsibilities for specific, what we describe as drivers of ecological change. So we think of warming, we think of introduction of pollutants and nitrogen-based fertilizers to waterways. We think of desertification and greater fire incidents, and all of these things are sort of these problems that are to be investigated. But a lot of times it is assumed that the ultimate social drivers of the incidence of those problems are unrelated to the scientific investigation. And so the Critical Ecology Lab is an intervention into that disconnect, and it prioritizes, as Raina introduced, the fact that Black and Indigenous and Brown perspectives have historically been deliberately marginalized from Western scientific investigations of the environment. And this is part of the reason why this distance has occurred between the real social drivers of ecological problems and their results in terms of harm to Black and Brown communities. As we see in the, I'm based in Oakland, California, on Ohlone Ramaytush land, and we are experiencing evacuations of people who, in a lot of cases, are unprepared and under-supported for fire evacuations. And so this is a social, just one example of any sort of social outcomes of ecological problems. And so the Critical Ecology Lab aims to investigate not just the kind of social impact that is disproportionately harmful to Black and Brown and Indigenous communities, but also their precursors, their social precursors and their sort of historical antecedents. I think my internet might be shaky, and so if you notice that, Raina, maybe please give me a little wave and let me know that I'm breaking up. I'll pause there just to give my other panelists an opportunity to introduce themselves as well.
You're good,
Thank you
Sue.
so
We
much.
heard everything.
Who wants to go next?
Oh, Kunal, it's you.
Hi, everybody. My name is Kunal. I'm a vampire today, if you couldn't tell. I have some like blood drips and, you know, the vampire vibe. Excited to see what other folks are, what their costumes are, or what they like plan their at-home costumes to be. Maybe in the discussion section, we can have our videos on or something. But yeah, I'm excited to be here. I think that I'll just share a little bit about how I got here and talk about my relationship to soil. I grew up also in New Jersey on the East Coast of the US and really spent a lot of time like outside and in gardens and in growing food and cooking food with my family. And that is, I think, like my first, like the first part of my life that like really like brought me fully in environment is through food, is through soil, is through growing vegetables. And I think that that's like a really like beautiful and like positive like relationship that I like have with the environment because of that. I remember going to like an arboretum in like a few towns over, like all the time. I would do summer programs when I was a kid, just like learning how to grow vegetables, like playing in the soil, like eating like raw beets out of the ground and like getting like dirt all in my mouth. And then I worked there as in high school as like other campers and whatnot, and really like got to see like upfront what it means to, or one way that it means to like cultivate like positive relationships with the land and help like little kids like be really excited and joyous in the outdoors. And I think that was like, that's what like really solidified like me being in the environmental field, me like caring and wanting to keep engaging with soil like for the rest of my life. I remember one day like walking into the arboretum as late as always and seeing like all the kids already like at the tables in the classroom, like getting ready to go outside, and they were like getting their seeds in little like Ziploc bags and packing like those like black plastic like seed planters, and they were like filling it with soil, and they were like mixing dry soil with water, and kids were just like screaming. There was like dirt everywhere, soil everywhere, and I like walked into this scene and was like, oh, like I have to be doing this like the rest of my life. And at that point, I didn't even know that soil science or like studies of soil was like a profession outside of like agriculture and farming. And so then I got to college and was like, oh, whoa, like there's a whole field where folks are studying the soil and relationships to the soil in some ways. And I was like super excited and was like taking soil science classes and learning about like soil fertility and biogeochemical cycles and pollutants and all these things. But then I quickly realized that a lot of that education was like severely lacking. And like everything Sue said is that like, it's like a really like Western, really like mechanistic, really like industrial view of our Earth. And I like felt that immediately because it was so in contrast to my relationship growing up, where it was like about like the joy, it was about food and family and culture, and it was about like getting like streaks of like soil on my face, and that's not something that was like talked about in my soil science classes. Like where is like the heart, where is the relationship, where is the care, and where is like the society in the soil. And so then I was like so excited to find Sue's work and be like, oh, like this person is like doing everything that I feel like is missing from the environmental field, is missing from soils research, is missing from like Western science. And I was like, I have to do anything I can to like work with Sue and be a part of the Critical Ecology Lab and study soil from a way that like felt authentic to like my own relationship. Because I think that that's something that's really important is to consider. And I think Tatiana might have said this in the beginning too, or alluded to this, that the connections and disconnections to environment like really like have to inform the way we keep going, the way we keep engaging, and anything that we do that can really like foster and help us like interrogate those like disconnections and connections is so important. And I could go on forever about this, but I'll say that now, like currently I'm based on Tohono, O'odham, and Pascua, Yaqui lands in Tucson, Arizona, and am studying pollution and more like and unjust and negative relationships, sometimes negative relationships to environment and soil, and really looking at the role of extraction and industry, and not only like individual, like, oh, like what is the role of this mine on soil health, but what is the role of this mine in a rural mining community where the mine is the only source of the economy. And if the mine is shut down or there's too many regulations in the mine, folks in town will lose their jobs. And really, like, it's this complicated issue that has to be discussed and worked with, because looking at land and looking at soil from a really point of view like doesn't serve anybody. So now I'm looking at the role of extraction, the role of like human supremacies and like really industrial like Western ways of engaging on communities and on soil at the same time. And I'm working with Dr. Ramirez Andriota at the University of Arizona for that work too. So I'll end there, but thank you for listening.
Thank you.
Hi, should I go now?
Yeah, go for it.
Good afternoon. First of all, Kunal, I was looking at your poster and I had to run and go get my Bread and Puppet book, which I love so much. So I already feel like you're kind of a kindred spirit. It helps me, lifts me in so many ways. I love Bread and Puppet. So, and I, in my 40s, I guess I just don't follow directions. So I have kind of a different, slightly different presentation. So I'll just, if that's okay, I'll just run through that. Is that all right? Okay. Let's see, I'm going to share my screen. And Kamal, I changed my first slide actually because can you see my?
Yeah, we can see your screen.
Now let me, all right. So that's my, my son and partner are out doing Halloween stuff, but we'd made some origami masks, which is pretty fun. So, all right, let me do. All right. So first, it's a little bit more of a presentation, but it's also just a kind of a way into our conversation today. And I'm really happy to be here in community. I kind of pulled myself away from the park on a sunny day here in New York. I feel like I've just been looking at digital boxes for 7 months and I was kind of bummed. But I realized that I'm going to be in community today and that over these past several weeks, this community of USI is just really distinguished in being comprised of people who I guess really retain their wonder about the world. And I just wanted to acknowledge that. And it's so much a result of our director, Tatiana Morin, and my colleagues, George and Igor and Margaret and Meg and Ed and Chino and Rich and Paul. So these people who I consider friends. So just wanted to say that. So RL emailed me at the end of the summer and said that they've been looking at my portfolio and were curious about a project that I did a couple of years ago called Sharp Song Crop Over. And so we had a conversation about it and they asked me if I'd unpack the production experience for this conversation, which seemed pretty straightforward and kind of an unexpected opportunity to revisit what was a really special project. And it turned out to be kind of a little bit harder than I thought. And I can't actually, let me see if I can see myself also here. I don't know. Okay, so this is Simone Bay. She's a philosopher and a kind of political thinker that I turn to often for different frames. And I had a kind of oppositional frame and kind of thinking about this project that I'm going to present. And she gave me space to think about it a different way. And my copy has carrots on it, but the title is the same, The Need for Roots. And it's a chapter in the second part called Uprootedness. And I just want to open with some words from her. To be rooted is perhaps the most important and least recognized need of the human soul. It is one of the hardest to define. A human being has roots by virtue of his real, active, and natural participation in the life of a community, which preserves in living shape certain particular treasures of the past and certain particular expectations for the future. And that frame of rootedness is more helpful than what I was going to talk about, which was narrative control and kind of ownership of the narrative at this place called Sylvester Manor, which I think kind of brings to mind sort of empire building and dominance, but in a project that was really about cultural production where I was really negotiating space in a complex way. It was about shared rootedness, and that frame kind of makes more sense to me from a human perspective. And as I was thinking about this project, which is now 5 or 6 years old, really the majority of this really hard work of deep change is incremental, and it's incomplete, and it's quiet, it's kind of ephemeral, it's local, it's relational, and it's done by and with people who kind of hold contradictions. And that really helped me get through this, because at first I was like, oh, I'll pick this project, but it wasn't realized in a way that I had wanted it to be. And that is kind of okay. I was able to see that. Just land on this for a bit on rootedness of this family. The title Sharp Song Crop Over was the title of a site-specific installation that I designed for Sylvester Manor, which is a former provisioning plantation on Shelter Island, which is an 8,000-acre island at the tip of eastern Long Island here in New York. Though the manor parcel is now about 250 acres. And Sylvester Manor became a fully independent nonprofit educational farm, art center, and music venue in July 2014. after being owned by a single family for over 15 generations since 1620. And I met Bennett, who's down here at the bottom, around 2005, when the property was just changing hands. And Bennett had just finished college, and my work has involved sort of labor in place and crop diversity and livestock diversity and the cultural stewards of those crops for many years. And he and I met in Virginia at a conference on biodiversity. And his uncle, who's, anyway, he's not a founder of Pixar, but he lives on the West Coast, and he's Eben Fisk Otsby, who's here. And he, had complicated memories of this place, this very storied place. And they were in a canoe ride, and you can hear Bennett talk about it quite beautifully. And he offered it to Bennett, and he's like, I want to release this because it comes with a lot, it's heavy. And Bennett said, no, he's like, I don't want it. And then a few minutes later, he said, yes, I'm going to take it, and I'm going to open it. I'm going to work with you to like change what this place is. And so that was, and so that's kind of where a little bit after that is where I enter the story, because there are so many stories that are in the ground here. And I just want to locate it for a second. So it's a Sylvester Manor. It was a provisioning plantation, meaning they grew out mostly like hogs and sheep for salt pork and mutton to go to Barbados, which is where the Constant Plantation was. And that's kind of the reason why Sylvester Manor existed. They had a massive sugar plantation in Barbados. And so the English, I don't know if you can see this here. So it's just a very classic like triangular trade, an example of that. And the family was quite, I guess, in air quotes, smart. They bypassed, the Bay of New York to go out to, sorry, I'm having trouble with this, to go out to Gardiner's Bay. It was just a lot easier for them to avoid taxes and many things, and kind of getting back and forth in this kind of dark trade. And really quickly, the Sharpsong cropover was physically composed of two parts. It was an ensemble of large cane knife instruments, idiophones made of steel that visitors to the manor could play, and then a bagasse seed pattern labyrinth. And bagasse is kind of the residual fiber that's left over after pressing sugar cane. And the cane knives of Sharpsong cropover had sort of a twofold conception. They were kind of an homage to the machete, right? The simple, really universal farm tool. And, cane was one of the last crops to be harvested mechanically. And it was about this new kind of field song, one radiating from field tools, because the manor was being transformed into an art center and a musical venue. And there is a soundscape, because I had spent time doing fieldwork in Louisiana and sugar plantations. There's a soundscape to cutting that's mechanized now, but I was working with some heirloom crop varietals, and so I wanted to focus on that. And there's also sort of a kind of choreography to your body. It sounds poetic and romantic, and it wasn't. It was very violent and kind of awful work, but there is a way in which your body sort of moves to cut the canes. And so this was a way, in a material way, to kind of an exercise in telling some of the sort of honest and difficult, sort of messy stories about New York's agricultural history. And then, of course, the labyrinth was, cane fields are labyrinthine, and absolutely. And cropover, part of the installation's title, refers to a really old Bajan, Barbadian laborers festival celebrating the end of the sugarcane harvest. And it's been held in Barbados since the 1780s. And it's one of our few carnivals in the summer in the Caribbean. And, they still have the, pick a crop monarch, and there's a ceremony of the last delivery of the last canes. And so it was really this way to kind of, my proposal and kind of work developing this installation was really about kind of this messy place of the past is present, the present is past. But back to how the narrative is presented. This is something that is produced by the Manor, and I want to share it with you.
Like so many historic properties, experience at the Sylvester Manor Gardens over time depended on who you were and when you were. Over 4 centuries, the stories of the manor and the garden have been interwoven. They have been a place of labor and struggle, of contemplation and repose, a place of production, cultivation, growth, death, and rebirth. Today at the Manor, we're working to understand more and more stories of the people who have inhabited this place. The gardens are open for all to explore. We invite you to experience the joyful rebirth of a new season here at Sylvester Manor.
So that's a really beautiful piece, and it was produced kind of maybe while I was still working with them, or maybe a little bit afterwards. But I introduce it because I think you know, nostalgia can be kind of insidious. You know, when people, and I think this is done really well. I want to say that, and when I opened this conversation into this project, which will be short, but I really meant it wholeheartedly that you know, we all hold contradictions, and that there is a way in which this kind of work for social change is really complex, and that there are people moving forward in good directions in a very complicated space who feel a sense of rootedness, and it's anyway there, and it's also it's very hard. You know, when people feel nostalgic for slave plantations and have weddings and parties there, as is, you know, the case here, those activities and stories have a deadening effect on the current manifestations of racism. You know, because nostalgia reimagines space in an abstract way, and it romanticizes something that's complex, and it removes voices from narratives, and it really unroots the history of a lot of people. And so in my installation, I wanted to sort of include more roots, make that evocative, that say that this is not so much just a place of beauty, rather it's really a place of complicated beauty. And so one of the points of departure into kind of telling these stories was through archaeology, and it's nice to be in this context. This was before my time with USI. My entry point into this kind of work was through archaeology and material culture. This is not my project that I was on, but these are soil pits from the original excavations uncovered, which uncovered the remains of several buildings that date to the early history of the manor, as well as a large pit that contained the remains of 13 large pigs that were completely butchered. They were deposited sometime between 1650 and 1670. And kind of think that they represented a large shipment of salt pork to either the Constant or Carmichael plantations, which were the Sylvester family's plantations on Barbados. And so, you know, archaeologists want to understand how cultures change and how artifacts relate to organizing principles that tie a whole society together, and how kind of over time these organizing principles shift. And so this opened up a space, certainly for Bennett and Sarah Gordon, who was the creative director at the time, who I worked with, and the interim executive director, and they were really open to kind of understanding and complicating the narrative that was, you know, being told in the manor house every day, especially on the weekends, several times a day. And this is a wonderful Matt Griswold, who's from Texas, done a lot of work, you know, in Virginia as well as here. And sorry for the poor image quality. She wrote this book that eventually became about, with the subtitle, 3 Centuries at a Slave Plantation on Long Island. And so it came out, I think I was already working on the installation, and I guess to say that, you know, there is still, even as I was kind of working on a project, there's still a kind of way in which there are certain people who can tell the stories, the difficult stories. And that's, it's not in a Goebbels kind of way of like, you know, control of the narrative. It's not, you know, as dark as that, but it is, that is the case. And this is the manor house, and this is, I think, the head of current head of the farms. And this is kind of what most people who go to the manor house want. They want to rest in this place of kind of comfort and leisure, and it's pretty, and you know, there are layers of history, and you kind of imagine yourself as part of the aristocracy, you know, and this kind of thing. And it's a beautiful, generative place where they have woofers from all over the world who come and really do work the land, and they have wonderful CSAs, and yet, like, that's, I don't know that is a whole history, kind of like what RL was saying, you know, this is about kind of knowledge propagation and what we can do. And I just realizing and revisiting this project, how what I was trying to connect with my experience in the Bayesian community here in Brooklyn was just didn't fit into this. This is Bennett and his wife. They're both musicians, really amazing people, very open. I stayed at the house overnight with my own family, and he turned into kind of a bluegrass destination for bluegrass music, and it was very special and alive, and it really, I think, healed the land. I mean, there are acknowledgements of, you know, the contradictions, right? They're Quakers. I mean, the burial grounds of the Quakers next to those of the enslaved Blacks, African and Native Long Islanders here. And then this is also part of it, right? This is Crop Over Festival in Barbados. And this is happening now. It's also had the same trajectory, you know, and how do maybe we can talk about this, like how, you know, there's a way in which, you know, there's studies of Calypso and people done PhDs on it, and soca, and, you know, there's a way in which we kind of own and kind of appropriate different narratives to kind of for liberation and release. Anyway, sorry, I think my family's coming in. Okay, I'm on my call, right? Sorry about that. And I move more quickly now. Really interested in cartography and mapping. So I looked at the depths in the Bay. And I would say, without trying to sell the project short, it ultimately became these really kind of beautiful printed pieces instead of the installation that we passed out. Within the back of these were narratives of the connection between crop over in Barbados, about tools of harvest, about Sylvester Manor, and about kind of what we could do musically with this installation. So this is kind of from my studio. I did a kind of study of, I'm not a musician, but I researched, you know, forms and materials to determine kind of design options for cane knife instruments. You know, looked at, you know, chimes and weather activated instruments, and I just this world of manufacturing sound, how to construct a resonating chamber. And I decided that I just wanted to create a kind of crude instrument that would alter sound, but not to any kind of technically accurate scale. And they kind of remain tools of the field. And so a studio shot, and just again, just playing around. And we had funding for this, you know, Cumberland Packing Company and Taste and Cultures Foundation, people involved in sugar industry right now, supported this work. And so we got to a place where it's really kind of, I guess, as an artist, you know, doing this project, you know, we're researching a lot of things. The castings were all going to be for the poles, you know, they were cast from sugar canes, and then you have all these different, kind of different presentations of it. We went on, got some sites selected behind the manor house, at the children's garden. The labyrinth we were able to do with bagasse, which is really nice because it's a seed pattern labyrinth. which can be done collaboratively. And this is from my time in Louisiana with the canes. I mean, it's, you know, they're full of rats and snakes, and, you know, they attract bees once you start cutting them, and it's complicated. And I realize I'm probably going over, so I'm gonna go quickly through these slides. Just to say again, like past is present, present is past. These are folks working on some of the heirloom, small plots of heirloom cane. And cane is still a very intense, labor-intensive crop, right? These trucks run, this is when I was in Patsouville and Jeanneret in Sugar City. And it's just, I'm going back and forth from these slides. It's like 24 hours a day. Like the cane mills don't stop. They're just taking cane through and through. And the mills are, you know, it's all steam run, and it's all the, you know, the sugar, and there's this film on everything. And so it's just trying to get a way of kind of how this crop and how this labor and work on this, kind of, it just kind of penetrates everything. Again, mechanized, it's still quite dangerous work. Again, just shifting to offer some context. The life that kind of comes after the crop is cut and over, exposes a lot of the, you know, soil microbiomes and biota. That's our, where the sugar is processed now, to give you a sense of scale. And I'm, running through a lot of things. We can talk more later. And then this should work. I think maybe it's not working. Oh, I don't think it's working right now. But if anyone wants to guess which children's toy is made of sugar, it's my little joke. It's they're Legos. I wish this worked. This is not quite working right now, but made from bagasse. And this is just an image from Crop Over. And the theme this year was kind of COVID, and just kind of we can talk more about tradition and past and present. And that's it. I'll just end it there.
Makalé, and to everyone who spoke. So many threads between what everyone was saying. There's a couple things that I am really excited to talk more about. One of those is storytelling and the narrative we tell about the soils in crisis, the ecological crisis. Suzanne was talking about this, and where we locate the roots of the crisis, and then the spatially, racially unequal effects of this crisis, and also the temporality and the timescale of this crisis. Like, do we understand it as happening now or happening for the last 400 years? The other thread that I'm interested in talking about is relationships, and relationships to the ground and relationships to the soil. And then I'm also really interested in ecological modernization and the sciences, and like what kind of knowledge gets considered to be legitimate, and what kind of technologies we are considered to, quote unquote, like solve the crisis that we're in, and who benefits from those technologies. But yeah, I guess I'd like to start from the first thought about storytelling. And something that I really am really excited about the Critical Ecology Lab model is the way you've kind of identified the importance of historicizing the current crisis, and like locating the roots of climate change, in the transatlantic slave trade, plantation monocultures, indigenous dispossession of lands, and destruction of traditional stewardship of the land. So I guess my question is, like, what is that story for you? What is that alternate story that you're telling that is not just kind of this Anthropocene narrative of, oh, humans as in the generic universal are responsible for climate change, but like, I think something Sue said was like, who is specifically, what population is specifically responsible? And like, in all of my research, like the population that is specifically responsible is white people, white Westerners, who have forcibly forced their conception of agriculture and land and property onto other people around the world, and argued that it was the best. Yeah, so kind of like problematizing the Anthropocene narrative, and then what does another narrative like allow us to do, and how does it allow us to think? So. And feel free to just hop in.
Yeah. I'm going to turn my video off just because I'm afraid that I'll get my sound will get shaky, and I want to just make sure I can actually say stuff. So sorry about having video off. First, those are just such really, really great leads, RL, and I'm just really appreciative of, I think, the way that you phrased or framed this is a perfect union between the wonderful presentation that Makalé just gave us and some of the questions that I have been also really curious about and emotionally tied to as a scientist. And the first thing I want to point out is, and Makalé, if I'm also pronouncing your name wrong, please like give me a big wave and just say, girl, stop. Here's how you say my name. But the memory and the relationship between the present generation of the family that was in ownership of the manor, and the relationship between their family's history and industry on that land, and the present reality of the kind of, the youngest generation having to make a decision about how to represent what that history is, as well as use that space as ecological stewards of that land on Long Island is directly related to the types of environmental kind of research questions that I think Kunal and I want to move forward in our discipline of environmental science. And I don't know that that makes immediate sense, so I'm just going to try and unpack that a little bit. Makalé, your presentation really pointed out, first of all, the trade relationship that I think is so important for what Reina is bringing up. The relationship between exchange of products produced in these different landscapes, the people who are either owners, quote owners, rather takers of that land, and the people who are subject to becoming tools on that land is an important ecological question, because as RL is pointing out, the relationship between, wow, hang on, I'm bored. Okay, sorry, my cat was freaking out as I'm like trying to talk about something somewhat serious. The relationship between our present ecological crisis and these early stages of industrial agriculture and large-scale trade are really something to investigate. I think, so there's this question about how people, so African enslaved people and indigenous people who were removed from the manor itself, were used as tools to manipulate the ground. And the manipulation of the ground is an ecological act, is an actual landscape change, but it's born of the intentions of this family, right? Like it's born of their stated needs and an agreement amongst themselves to pursue this particular industry. And so I'm really curious about how a family like that really deals with the fact that in the present day, in 2020, we're experiencing an ecological crisis that threatens our societal existence, right? But at the root of that crisis is this sort of long-term decision-making process that that uses both bodies as well as land as tools in that process. And so there's this like ecological tension between, I think, kind of responsibility of like whose lineage is related to that ecological manipulation and what are the present day consequences in terms of kind of our transitions into industrial agriculture and industrial agriculture's relationship to present day climate change. So these are some of the links that I'm noticing, and I want to leave it to our co-panelists to maybe share with.
Well, thank you. I'll jump in, and it's Makalé, but it's I feel the love, so it's, and I feel, yeah. Is it Haitien? Are you Haitian?
Ouais, bien sûr.
Are you Haitian?
Yeah, I'm a Zo.
Okay. Yeah, I know it wasn't just a question just for me, but I think this question of supply chains and is a big one, and I think it's historicized and it's also very contemporary. I think we think about kind of mining of metals for our phones and ways of communicating and connecting now. I think we're kind of making explicit some of kind of the complexities along the supply chain, but also this question of the manipulating the land. I mean, it's something I think about with Europeans often, friends who say, like, especially French friends who are like, oh, you Americans, you're so, it's such an American problem. Like when, the birder incident happened, or, they frame it as an American issue because so much was kind of displaced and offshored, in West Africa, where my family is from, or, in the Caribbean, and, whereas here in the States, they're just kind of these dense layers that just kind of get stacked on each other. And so something about soil memory and sort of kind of the site of labor and production, kind of needs to be sort of reconnected to something that I'm thinking about, because one of the reasons why, there's a kind of relativity to the historical narrative at Sylvester Manor is because, that they didn't have a sugar plantation there, it was a provisioning plantation. And so that's a bit removed. And so it's like, but yet still, it's this kind of nested kind of communities of, I don't know how to frame it, exploitation, or, and I want to hear from you, Kunal and RL. But just one more thing I've been thinking about a lot is kind of this linguistic relativity and, just kind of the obvious of like, there's more than one way to think about a problem. Like, kind of RL, you're kind of locating it, in many ways, rightly so, within European kind of mercantilism and the trajectory there. And I think, hopefully this will come out right, because it's kind of a thought that is not totally formed, but I think, there's the obvious, right? There's more than one way to think about a problem. And then that the approach a person takes kind of depends on their past experience. And then building on that, kind of what Danziger talks about, as a linguist, you know, linguistic relativity proposes that, you know, speaking a particular language is kind of one of the kinds of experiences that's sort of relevant in selecting strategies. And I feel like this kind of being multilingual, and I think of art as also another language and music as another language, just kind of offers you at an unconscious level an ability to kind of have alternative ways of approaching the world and studying. And so anyway, I think that that's something that happens here at USI. And I think it's necessary as we kind of make our way forward. Anyway, those are some things I'm thinking about also. And also just for the soil scientists, and you too, Suzanne, that, you know, I was at the time, I didn't have a background in soil science, but, you know, I just knew that the soils were acidic, and, you know, and archaeologists, you know, they kind of mine for kind of material culture, but to what extent, you know, that, you know, what did the bones do? What you know, in terms of the calcium? I mean, there are a lot of ways in which that soil and those pits could have been read, or maybe were read, or I didn't understand, you know, kind of the analysis. And so I think that, you know, I need to pull that in so that there's a larger, a more cohesive and coherent and inclusive story of that land.
I think something I'm thinking about now is what is the role of reparations and land back in this conversation of responsibility, lineage, and ecological disaster? Because I think it's I guess so. That's another question for folks. What do you how do we or do we even make these former plantations and manors, what is their responsibility? Is there something deeper than an educational event or a verbal acknowledgement? What is the social, economic, artistic, emotional responsibilities of these of the current stewards of these areas? And I think that the people that have to answer those questions are people from from the lineages that were impacted. So I don't know if I guess I'm just posing the question. I'm not trying to answer it.
And that there's a kind of what you're getting at too, which is what I experienced. And again, we all hold contradictions, and it's this work isn't campaign and so kind of oppositional, but there are certain people who can tell the messy stories. And this installation, it could just be that, I mean, art is, people like it and they don't, and it could be that that's all it is, but it's also about who, whether it's in the lineage, who do people feel comfortable hearing these messy stories from? And I don't know that it's always, not always us. I don't know, RL, what do you think? I feel like, you're holding space in a strong way. And how do what kind of reception do you feel in your art community, political community, music community? I'm curious.
I mean, as a white person, I think that when I share information that I have learned from listening to Black scholars, particularly about the legacy of slavery in the US, or not even scholars, thinkers, people pay attention. And I think that that is absolutely a critical issue. Who shares the story, and then what kind of validity does it then have? But I was just thinking about Kunal's question about land back, and I've been thinking a lot about Reconstruction after the US Civil War, and this really wild opening that was shut down, but where the whole of the Confederacy and all of the land that was held in plantations was basically up for redistribution. And like what, one of my propositions is kind of that emancipation is unfinished, right? Like the Civil War is not over. And thinking in this kind of like trans-historical space, like what does it look like to imagine that, to acknowledge that Reconstruction was this radical opening and possibility for land-based and agrarian reform? And what would it look like to sit in that space today and reimagine the land ownership of the United States? And I think that it's, this is something I believe the theorist Frank Wilderson says, but he says, I think it's something like it's impossible for people to imagine land, like what land back would look like. And I think that because that is so difficult, I think we have to sit with that question. And I think that I'm really curious about the role of soil scientists in this conversation. Is there a way in which soil scientists can use their legitimacy as scientists to bolster advocacy for land back? Like we know that the forest fires in California are caused in part because indigenous folks were not allowed to practice their stewardship using controlled burning that would prevent this kind of like these massive fires. And that's just one example of many in terms of thinking about the like vital ecosystem roles that indigenous folks did and still continue to play in kind of like attempting to create a future in which humans are still living, like able to live on this planet. Yeah, that was kind of long and drawn out, but yeah.
I just wanted to respond to your point, Arl, about how people with science backgrounds and soil science in particular can kind of use that perceived legitimacy as a tool. And I both see what you are raising and kind of have lived that as having pursued this career as that, with that goal in mind in a way, to kind of co-opt the legitimacy of Western science and academia to use that as a sort of manipulation of power structures with relation to the environment. But what I've come to notice is that really what we're doing is delegitimizing the narratives that Western science has created. So I'm not actually as interested in kind of using a degree as a microphone for indigenous Black people, but rather as a bias on intentions. I'd love for Kunal to think a little bit or talk a little bit more about that perspective, because I think going back to like why have a critical ecology lab, because it's separate, right, from academia, and it's intended to be kind of a parallel universe to academic science in a way. But for me, the intention there is to shed light on the ways that understanding soils has really been so closely tied to the production of cash crops with Black and brown bodies as tools. And so I'll stop there, but that's my perception of how we can use science, or what science can do in this space.
I just love the phrase you used, like delegitimizing Western science. Like, yeah, because I think like this is like, I get like harkening back to like some of the other questions Ara was posing, is like, what Western, like Western science is founded and based on so many supremacies, that how could it ever be representative or tell a truth? And so I think getting back to this idea of local place-based traditional indigenous peasant villager knowledge is a way to delegitimize like the ivory tower and like academia, because that's not where the most truth comes out. And I think like soil scientists have like an incredible responsibility to like reject academia, and like, yeah, there are ways we can like redistribute power and like creating like legitimacy in the eyes of like a federal government that is on stolen land. Like we have to what does it mean to be like striving for legitimacy in this context of like of the US government or whatever, like US institutions. And it's like I'm not going to accept these institutions as like the ones to give me power, to the ones that will ever actually like fully consider like reparations. Like that's not going to happen. And so like why I don't want to support that kind of institution. And at the same time, like I am in an academic institution right now. I am supporting like quote unquote Western science. And it's like this incredible tension that I feel. But critical ecology and like a lot of the other work of folks on this call are like are really asking us to reconsider like what do we hold to be like the bastions of information, and asking us to reconsider like what is our own relationship to knowledge, to community, and to the earth. And I think that like we really need to like interrogate that and take steps to again like delegitimize. I love that, delegitimize these unjust institutions, because it's like I think it also brings up this question, and like I'll pause after this thought, of like reform versus revolt and revolution is like what are like how much can we reform an unjust institution? It's never going to be just.
I just want to thank you both for that. And I want to, it just reminded me of something that Darren Moten said on the, I don't know, the second day of the symposium, or maybe we were just talking, I can't remember. He just said, Black people could have asked for anything, when they were released and freed, and they asked for 40 acres and a mule and land. That's how deep land, that's how significant land is. And yeah, I mean, RL, there's a, way in which, I mean, rootedness, it is because we all share this kind of need for a rootedness, and we all experience it, and we all are rooted. I mean, you're rooted in your own community, I mean, we all are. And so how, how can we kind of pull those layers out to kind of reappropriate the land in a more equitable way? And it's, I mean, there's so many things to say, right? Like class is a big issue. I mean, in West Africa and Guinea, it's, there's a harshness there to class. In Haiti as well. I have family in Haiti. It's so brutal. I'm not going to say that it's a universal, but it's harsh. And I think of my generation, like Gen X, and we were kind of trained to be part of these institutions, right? To have mobility, to, have the cultural capital that, you and Kunal, have, and so that we can operate in these spaces and, work also at a policy level maybe, or have the, financial comfort, because we are operating within a system, right? Like all of us who've worked in nonprofits know, like, it's ridiculous, sometimes if you have to have like financial and cultural capital to be able to affect change in some ways. Otherwise you are, in some ways you're impoverished, like you don't have good housing, you don't have health insurance. I mean, they're very real things to choosing to kind of be a part, separate, that is, and so I'm just thinking aloud about, you know, kind of labor and work and place, and, you know, kind of, you know, delegitimizing all of that, and also kind of, you know, what do we want? And I just wanted to pull out this book. I was at RISD last year, and Chikanitsa, he teaches at MIT in the design department. This is such a great book. I don't know if anyone's familiar with him, but he speaks a lot about language and design, and this idea that Africa is always the receptacle of technology primarily, and he's at MIT, but that, you know, to fix certain things, you know, then Africans are seen as like kind of leapfrogging certain technologies, you know, like telecommunications. But in fact, there's a really deep local, regional kind of culture of iteration and innovation, and that's very apart from and separate from, and has its own trajectory that's very distinct from European one. But we can't talk about it unless we have the like we speak our own languages, because when you speak, kind of like talking about like Eve's work on linguistic relativity, like when you speak another language, and it sounds like a lot of us do, you actually, you see things differently. You have different words, and I feel like, and it could also be music and art, but I just kind of, my little pitch also for having this conversation in other languages, which is what Chikanitsa has done. He's been holding convenings, kind of like what we're doing at USI, like all over Southern Africa, to kind of talk about other ways of being and thinking and laboring and kind of distributing.
Wow, yeah. This idea of delegitimizing the power of science is so powerful.
I just wanted to, sorry.
There's other thing that Chikanitsa says, oh, sorry, Suzanne, this one thing, it just says that, you know, there is something that's the production of knowledge, right? And Suzanne, like you as a PhD, other doctoral candidates on the call and PhDs, like you produce knowledge, right? And so, and knowledge is produced within a social context. And so like that, and you can't distinguish those two. So I think you're so right, everyone, about like needing to integrate them, which is why I love your lab and the work that you're doing to kind of daylight that complicated work, right? It's messy.
Yeah, I mean, and just one other thing that I wanted to offer back to you, or reflect back to you, Makalé, is that what the Critical Ecology Lab is starting to notice, and when I say the Critical Ecology Lab, I mean myself, and like in dialogue with Kunal and in dialogue with our handful of collaborators, what's surfacing is that there is a certain level of like there's like a threshold that science, and I'll speak only about environmental science, but I think this could be more broad. It is a language deficit that we can only overcome in collaboration with artists, with linguists, with historians, with geographers and archaeologists, really. And I think what we're starting to notice is that our questions, these observations that we've kind of mused about throughout this conversation, and that RL has like really beautifully framed for us, can't really be articulated and then investigated using the tools of Western science without that open dialogue between those who are creative and work both in the present and retrospectively, and those who are using these kind of analytical and empirical tools. And that just what we've noticed, and what we think is really the boundary between using, you know, what you get out of a PhD and applying it to this like essentially liberatory and I guess like a process of redress for these harms, is that disciplines have been siloed, and it feels very intentional. And it feels like a part of the project of white supremacy to do that. So I'll stop there.
And also, I think just extending that with language, I mean, you know, when you're trained in soil science and it, you know, the genesis of it is located in Russia, and, you know, you think to yourself as a Black person, you see yourself erased in so many classrooms, right? Like from humanities to biology. And you're like, wow, like we just didn't know any of that, really? You know, and it's, you know, and yes, and I lived in Sweden, like, you know, went to Linnaean University, Linnaeus like categorized things. He's also a bit of a fascist, you know, like it's not that people don't have their own categorizations of things, or that a knowledge of soils and place didn't simultaneously occur in other places. So I just, for all the teachers on the call also, and for our work, like that how you, Baratunde talks about this as a comedian, you know, like how you compose your sentences is really important, you know, like you can't just locate, you know, the origin of, you know, knowledge in one particular place, even if it's quite sophisticated. And, you know, the Russians have my respect, and I, you know, I'm a student of the pedologists there, but it's also, it compromises a lot of people and delegitimizes their knowledge. And then the anthropological project is also complicated, right? Because then it's great because you have a validation of these other ways of thinking that, you know, it's relative, right? Like that, you know, it's based on your ecology and environment and your relationship to water. And so, I mean, all of these things like inform our worldview. And anyway, it's so important, like what you're talking about, and also just the language that we use as educators, even with our friends, to talk about where things come from or how they're understood is huge, because that gets repeated. I mean, I see that with my son even, and he's really young in school, like the canon, I mean, it has to be opened up, which is why your reader is really radical, RL, and I hope it's not radical one day, but, you know, the publishing industry you know, it's, you know, that stuff is, you sound like a conspiracy theorist, but it's controlled. The narrative is controlled.
I think like I want to add really quickly that a lot of like what is considered Western science is stolen technology from Black and Indigenous communities. Like Leah Penniman of Soulfire Farm talks about how like soil pH and like the texture by field tests and a lot of that like morphology, pedology work is like stolen from West African technology and relationships to land. And I think like that's something to really like know and integrate into everything that I do, as like is like this idea that like the knowledge that I am working with is not created and is not new to the universe. It's oftentimes a like a bastardization and like stolen way of understanding things that people have known and been creating for thousands of years. And that if like the more and the better that I can like understand those histories of like what I'm doing is that I'm not producing knowledge. I am building off of understandings that people have already had. And like what I'm trying to do is like is elevate the stories and relationships and knowledges that people already have known. And I like there is this other tension of like validating, like do we like I think we talked about this too, is like what does it mean to like validate those relationships and those like localized or like an inherited and generational knowledges? Like do we need to validate that? Who listens to it? And like what is that validation for? I'll pause there too. I feel like RL was trying to get in there.
I actually totally forgot what I was going to say, but
Sorry.
It's 3:30. I feel like all of you all's closing remarks were just super fabulous. This feels like a conversation that could go on for so long, and I hope that it's just a seed of many conversations to come. And yeah, thank you all for participating, and yeah.
Thank you so much, RL, for inviting us at the Critical Ecology Lab and just doing such a beautiful job of framing and facilitating this conversation.
Thank you so much. And thank you for your work in soil memory. Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Thank
thank you and Makalé, like really appreciate everything you shared.
Likewise, likewise. I look forward to staying connected with all of you. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Big
And
love
thanks
out
for
to
everyone
Cali.
listening.
Great, thank you. And if you want to order a reader, the link is in the chat.
I'll also just share the link to our lab website in case anyone's curious. So you can check it out.
I just want to say, because I'm with USI, a big thanks to USI for creating this space, because they're walking the walk, you know? So yeah, it's great.